Welcome to the Endurance Drive podcast. Our mission is to share the key principles that structure our approach to endurance training and coaching. I'm Katie, and today our usual listeners will notice that our intro is a little bit different and that we're releasing an episode on a Monday instead of our usual Thursday. And that's because this is a very special episode that's actually the start of a series that we're going to be releasing over the month of February called Female Athlete Stories. And I'm going to be joined by Elena Horton on the next several Mondays to cover some super exciting content. So Elena, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Katie. Psyched to be here.
So Elena is our newest coach on the Endurance Drive squad. She's a trail running expert, an incredible coach, and she's all around just an awesome human. So we're going to do a whole other deep dive on her background and her coaching expertise on our regular Thursday podcast later on. But on Monday, she's going to be here to talk about a bunch of different female athlete topics with me.
Yeah, big topics. Something I've been really excited to talk about with you, Katie. So really excited to get this series going.
Awesome. So I think actually a natural starting place will be to talk about how Elena and I met because it's very related to these conversations about female athlete stories. And we actually bonded over a shared favorite book, which is Good for a Girl by Lauren Fleshman. But to back up, we went to college together but didn't know each other very well in college. I think maybe we knew who the other person was, but we had a lot of mutual friends, just didn't really connect during that time. And we have a very close mutual friend who got married over the summer. And we were both at this wedding and kind of serendipitously got seated across from each other at dinner. And we really hit it off. I think we had an idea of what the other one was up to just in the endurance world, but we were really excited to make that connection. And I forget which one of us it was, but somebody said, like, have you read Good for a Girl?
Yeah, I think that was shot out pretty quickly. And then both of our husbands mutually were like, where did they go? We had to disappear for like 2 hours.
Yeah. I thought it was 15 minutes, but we did disappear for like 2 hours to talk about Good for a Girl and just our shared experiences in the female athlete space. So one thing led to another. We've spent some time together since then, and now we're coaching together. So it's really excited to kind of go full circle from our favorite book. But quick plug, we're going to come back to this. If you haven't read Good for a Girl by Lauren Fleshman, please run it. I think the subtitle is A Woman Running in a Man's World. And it's just such an incredible book that I think basically circles around a lot of themes that we'll talk about today.
I also wrote a review of the book for the Craftsbury Green Racing Project, so I'll include that link in the show notes if you want a quick cursory overview before committing to it. But I promise you, once you start it, you won't put it down because it reads like a page turner while also having a lot of great information in it.
Absolutely. Yeah, so big plug for that. But now to transition into kind of why we're here today. As some of you may know, this week is National Girls and Women in Sport Day. That's on Wednesday. And a few weeks ago, we got the idea that maybe we could do a special podcast episode to sort of celebrate that day and shed light on a lot of issues specific to female athletes. So we ended up sending around this Google form trying to get stories for this episode. And Elena, could you tell us a little bit about what this form looked like?
Yeah, absolutely. It was pretty simple. We sent out this form. We kind of blasted it on social media. We encouraged friends and friends of friends to keep sharing it. So it had 4 main questions. The first was, what's the most rewarding thing about being a female athlete? What's the most challenging thing about being a female athlete? Any stories or anecdotes that you would want to share? And then just a list of recommended gear items that you could share with us. So it was pretty broad. I think people took it in whichever ways resonated with them because of that open-ended questioning. And we got a lot of great responses, which is super cool.
I was similar to when we launched this podcast. I was like, I don't know if one person's going to listen to it or one person's going to fill out my form, but we got a ton of responses from people both that we did know and that we didn't know. And I think not only the quantity of responses, but I was also really impressed with the quality of responses. People wrote us literally paragraphs about challenges and rewards. And we have a gear items list that's probably like 100 items long right now, which is really, really cool to crowdsource that knowledge. But basically what we did after that was tried to bring together all the themes that were in these responses, organize them, and figure out a series of episodes that we could do. And so that's the big reveal right now. This is not a single episode. This is going to be a multi-episode series. And right now, I think we have a minimum of 5 episodes planned over the course of the next several Mondays. But, after that, it could even go further than that.
Yeah, it's super exciting to get going with it. We're hoping to maybe get more information from people as we keep crowdsourcing, maybe do some additional interviews in the future. So it's definitely a topic that we don't want to treat lightly.
Exactly. And actually, before we jump into those topics, I want to give a few disclaimers. So the first one has to do with inclusive language. And in our forum, we were really open to stories and experiences from all female and or women identifying athletes, acknowledging that women identifying doesn't always mean biologically female and vice versa. We're going to try our best to just use the terms that were submitted in our response form, but our goal here is to really just be as inclusive as possible for that whole community. And then a couple other disclaimers. So I kind of wanted to put out like a trigger warning. We will cover some topics that can be a little bit hard to hear about related to, for example, disordered eating, eating disorders, body image, some topics related to mental health. And we'll throw some resources for those things in the show notes. But please just get help if you need it. And always feel free to reach out to us if we can be helpful. And then finally, we will talk about some sort of medical adjacent topics, but we're not doctors. So always check with a doctor before switching up any of your training regimen, or if you're having any medical issues, that's the first resource to go to. So with that, I think we'll segue into what we're going to do today. And our goal is to give you a high-level overview of the big topics that we're going to cover in this series. And then we'll move into talking about some of our own experiences, because I think those can sort of explain why we care so much about this and weave them back into the topics that we'll cover. So Elena, why don't you take the first one?
Yeah, absolutely. So the first big topic that we grouped together from the responses we got in the survey was that we're going to call the episode The Female Body. This is going to cover a few larger topics, but we'll start by just grounding it in a quote that we got from the survey, and we'll do that for each of our topics just to give you a sense of the kinds of responses we received. So this quote was, "Managing nutrition and body image. I have learned over time that my nutritional needs are different from my male counterparts, and that I am more vulnerable to injury, anemia, REDS, etc. when my nutrition is poor. It also took me time to internalize the fact that societal ideals for an athletic female body are often different from what real, strong, and healthy female bodies look like." So that hits a few things. I think to further elaborate on what those main topics will be is the objectification of the female body, aging and how the female body experiences aging, especially from an athletic lens, hormonal changes, of course, and how that we train around our periods and PMS symptoms. And then also how this interacts with the medical system. I know many of us have gone to try to get treatment for different concerns we have, and how that can be challenging navigating the medical system when it's specifically female athlete concerns. So that's the first broad topic, would be the female body episode. That'll be our next episode.
Awesome. And then after that, we're going to move into our, I guess that'll be the third episode, and we're calling that Community in Sport. So something that a lot of people wrote in about was just how incredible generally the community of female athletes can be. One quote that I really liked was someone talking about what's most rewarding about being a female athlete. And they said, simultaneously, the sense of self-sufficiency, independence, competence, and the absolute joy that comes from training with and adventuring with other women. There's nothing more inspiring to me than looking around at my friends and training partners and thinking, wow, these are some really badass women who push me, inspire me, and make this whole thing so much fun. And the relationships you build and conversations you have while running for hours are just such a different layer of intimacy, comfort, and familiarity. It's just such a joy to get to live life on and off the trails with these women. So that quote really spoke to me. I definitely have that community of women in sport. And so we'll talk about that community a lot. But I think we'll also talk about how sometimes that can be a community that's hard to break into. So we really want to take an intersectional perspective on community in sport, sometimes how there's these cross-cutting challenges between gender, between race, between income, all these other things in terms of community. So that will be our deep dive of episode 3.
Yeah, I love that quote too. And that really resonates. Moving into our next episode, episode 4, we're calling it The Forces We're Up Against. It's kind of the catch-all for these kind of more amorphous cultural experiences that we've had in sports, specifically from the women's perspective. So a quote that we really liked that kind of exemplified this was when we were talking about challenges that you've had in sport. One of our writers wrote, "While we have come a long way for women in sports, it still feels like we have so far to go. The most challenging aspect is feeling like no matter how fast or successful you are in your sport, a lot of people still think that women are slower, weaker, or not as impressive as men in the sport. That yes, you may be successful, but you are successful in the women's field, using that term as a caveat to success. A prime example was the backlash that the women's only Ironman World Championship faced. The immense number of people who were sharing that the field was watered down because it was a women's only event, that many of the women didn't deserve to be there, etc. It was insane, especially when these comments continued despite the record-breaking performances across the board in October. Trying to overcome those voices and pushing back the feeling that I have to prove my worth in a space is something that continues to challenge me." I think that just speaks to some of the challenges that we face with trying to take ourselves seriously and build that confidence. It kind of relates with the community, but it has a separate lens. So that's why we're bringing it out of the forces we're up against. And there's other things that go into that as well. I think another big topic that came up was how balance is so challenging, and balance is a myth. for women, particularly with the pressures of you might be raising kids or trying to have a career and how you make all that work with training.
Absolutely. Yeah. This quote too. I mean, being at the Ironman World Championships and all the time there were these comments about like, yeah, well, this is the Women's World Championships. And there always has to be that caveat when I think it's really meaningful to say like, this is just the World Championships. So I really love that quote. So our last episode that we have planned is episode 5, and it's called How It Makes You Feel. So this is something that has both its positive and negative components, but I would say that the positive ones really stood out the most. We probably got at least 25 to 35 responses of people saying it just makes me feel strong and unstoppable. It makes me feel this sense of camaraderie and belonging. And one of the quotes I really liked that exemplified this was someone saying, what's rewarding about being a female athlete is feeling strong, doing things that scare me, and realizing that I'm capable of them. Discovering again and again that my body is powerful, cool, and amazing for the sights it lets me see and the things it allows me to do. All things that are very separate from being pretty, attractive, sexy, or hot in a more hand-wavy sense. Trying hard things is hot. Finding community with people, doing hard things together, supporting each other, and driving one another towards doing what our bodies allow us to do. So that I hope will end sort of on an uplifting note. But again, we can think about the challenges here too. The challenges of being uncomfortable in a female body or feeling those challenges throughout the lifespan, I think is something we'll really come back to. So super excited to dive into that episode.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that theme of duality will be true in like all of the episodes, right? Of every lens from that we can look at this from, we'll have like a positive and a negative side of it, which is just how we kind of dive into that nuance as we go. So really excited to have more of a deep dive in all of these topics. That's why they all deserve their own episode because they're all pretty complex. I also love that quote. Trying hard things is hot.
Yeah, it's super hot, super sexy.
I'm trying to embrace that way more. I love that.
And the number of people who just said the word badass. Like, this is all about being badass. So I love that.
Absolutely. Yeah, I love it. Great. So as Katie mentioned before, we're really looking forward to deep diving into all of these topics. But for today, we really just wanted to introduce the series and start by doing a quick recap of our own journeys. We've, of course, found a lot of power in relating to other stories, so we hope that this will help to briefly put these topics into context, in addition to showing why we just care so much about these issues specific to female athletes. So I'll get to start by interviewing Katie. And I know, honestly, some of this, but not as much of the nuance. So I'm really excited to kind of dive in a bit more to Katie's full story. So Katie, to start, can you just give us a little more background on how you got involved with sports in the first place?
Yeah, I'm really excited to do this because I realize, this is episode 11 of the podcast overall, but I've really never sat down and just been like, how did I get into the sport? And I don't think I've done that really in any context. So you heard it here first, and our podcast listeners will too. But I think I should probably go all the way back to, childhood. And I grew up in Sleepy Hollow, New York, which is a little bit north of New York City. And I was always a pretty outdoorsy kid. I loved to be outside. I danced quite a bit. So I did ballet, jazz, modern dance. And then my main organized sport when I was little was playing soccer. So I probably started that around age 6 or 7. And as you probably know, like 6 or 7-year-old soccer is pretty much just throw all the kids on the field, throw a ball on the field. Like maybe it gets in the goal, maybe it doesn't. But as soon as I turned 9 or 10, I think we focused a little bit more on actually having to find positions in soccer. And I'm not sure how it happened, but I started playing goalie around that time. And I really liked it. I think goalie was something that I really shined there because I wasn't someone who was like super, super aggressive on the field, but I loved to be in goal and just have my job. And I've always been someone who, I'll put a lot of pressure on myself, but I also really thrive under pressure. So something about that pressure of being in goal was really, really great. So anyway, did goalie for most of my elementary school career and then into middle school when I was also on the modified soccer team for my middle school. And I remember I showed up on the first day of junior varsity soccer in high school. It was the preseason right before high school soccer started. So I was 8th grade going into 9th grade. And I met the new coach, very excited to continue playing goalie as I had been. And the coach took one look at me and he said, "You're not going to play goalie." And
wait, what?
Yeah.
Had he seen you play goalie at all or no?
No, yeah. So literally had never seen me play before, but he'd asked me what my position was and I said goal. And he's like, "No, that's absolutely not going to happen." And I remember being really confused. I wasn't sure what was going on, but ultimately what he said was, "You're too small to play goalie." So he was right that I was small at the time. I was one of those kids who didn't really go through puberty until I was like 14, 15 and a half or something. And so I was definitely on the smaller side. And I think I grew probably 6 or 7 inches in the first couple of years of high school. But the fact that he basically looked at me, sized up my body, and then had this assumption about what I could do in sport, it was just a very jarring experience. And that was literally the end of my goalie career. Like, I did not play goalie again after that moment.
Oh my gosh, what'd you do then? That seems like a really big transition, actually.
Well, it's tough because if you've been practicing to be a goalie for your entire elementary and middle school existence, and then you show up and they're like, no, you're actually going to play a different position. I really didn't have the background to be good at any of the other positions. And so I kind of tried to do it, but I was simultaneously in this body that was busy growing 6 inches and being a high school freshman and being super awkward. And I just really was not doing it in that short season. And so as a result, I spent almost the entire season sitting on the bench my freshman year. I sat on the bench again for most of my sophomore year. And after that, I was like, I'm busy. I feel like I'm wasting my time here, traveling all around to different soccer games and not actually playing. And so it was after that I decided, okay, I'm going to switch to endurance sports. I'm going to go out for the cross country team. So I decided to make that shift sophomore into junior year.
How did you choose cross country? Because you can imagine there's plenty of other sports too. Was there something about it that kind of stood out to you?
Yeah, I think the main thing that stood out to me was that there was just no bench in cross country. I was so sick of sitting on the bench that I knew that at least in cross country, even if I walked, even if I was really bad at it, I would still get to fully participate. And the practices were a little bit shorter. The travel wasn't as intense. And I knew I wanted to do a sport. So I switched to cross country. But my high school did not have a super robust cross-country infrastructure. It was a single team, so there was not a men's and women's team. There was a cross-country team that was 95% boys and had, on average, 1 to 3 girls on the team. So that was the environment that I was entering with a single coach, and also not a lot of, there was no good training theory. There was nothing about heart rate. There was nothing. It was just go out and run and do it with the boys, and that's the way that it's going to be.
Was there I don't know if it matters or not, but did you have a male or female coach?
I had a male coach. And to his credit, he was a really great guy. I enjoyed working with him and everything, but he didn't have much of a background in cross country. He had a little bit of a background in mountain biking, but ultimately he was the PE teacher who was teaching cross country or coaching cross country. And so I think now to circle back to another big theme that we'll talk about in the female athlete space, something that I noticed really early on in, this mostly all boys team was really feeling this sense of otherness. It wasn't that people were unwelcoming, but there were very much some friend groups and the guys kind of all hung out and I was sort of on my own. And then the other part of that was I felt that I was treated a little bit different, sort of in terms of the gaze and where people are looking and what that looks like for female athletes versus male athletes. So I have this very vivid memory of being at some of these cross-country meets and all the parents would line up and watch the kids racing. And other parents, often other moms, would make comments to my mom or my parents and say oh, wow, she has such a runner's body. And I remember not even really knowing what that meant, but it was definitely a good thing, this whole runner's body. And the funny thing was I was not fast. I really was not good at cross country in the beginning. I think it took until my senior year for me to actually make it through our home cross country course without walking, really, really not good at cross country. And yet there was still this need to comment on my body and how it looked and how that related to my identity as a runner. And I think it started to subconsciously impact me in ways of being okay, well, I might not be that fast yet, but I do definitely have a runner's body. And so I want to hold on to that because that's something I'm getting a lot of validation for. And in retrospect, we'll come back to this. That's not something that you want to be doing for female athletes, for male athletes, for anyone. My runner's body was effectively just a prepubescent kid who had just grown 6 inches straight up and hadn't grown out yet. That's what it was.
How did you come to terms with that over your time? Because it sounds familiar, where it's you kind of hear about it and you don't really understand it, but then at a certain point you start trying to hold on to that validation. So what did that look like for you?
Yeah, well, I think it didn't really impact me in this tangible way until I went to college. So when I went to college, I had it in my head that it was going to be very different. Now that I wasn't running cross country anymore, I had also done winter track and spring track in high school. And I actually started to get better by the end of my time in high school. But I remember being very concerned that like I didn't really want my body to change. Like I was super happy about where it was. But I'd heard things about like, okay, well, you go to college and like the freshman 15 and whatever. Honestly, what that really is for most people is probably just normal adult development. But in my head, it was this thing that I just didn't want to change because I had always identified this like, pretty young teenage body that I had with being a runner. And that, of course, had dovetailed with getting better in the sport. So that was where I think, and we'll probably come back to this, but college for me was a time of some more sort of disordered eating because I was trying to resist these forces and actually just started thinking about like, well, I'm going to eat super healthy for the first time ever, which is often how these things can start. And that is not where you want to be as someone who probably was just in a position where I really need to gain weight, even to perform better and get faster in the sport.
Yeah, absolutely. So in college then, did you feel like you kind of went down that negative path of restrictive eating?
Yeah. And I would say actually, we've talked in this podcast before about relative energy deficiency in sport. And that's sort of this situation where your energy intake is not matching your energy output. It has to do with fueling, has to do with training. But I think that for me, relative energy deficiency in sport was certainly something that I fell into, but it actually happened independently and before there was any type of restrictive eating. So we've talked a lot about how like signs and signals of relative energy deficiency in sport, especially in female athletes, have to do with having a regular menstrual cycle. And so for me, I remember at the end of high school, I was getting more serious in the sport. I was doing well at track. I really enjoyed it. And then I just kind of out of the blue stopped getting my period. And I was like, this is awesome. We wear like booty shorts at track meets and I don't even have to worry about this thing being a potential issue. And I was like totally fine with it. And of course, did not connect this to anything related to training or fueling, but it suggests that even like age 17, end of high school, I was in this very red zone with respect to training and fueling. And again, sometimes this stuff is intentional. For me, it really was unintentional to start. And I think, honestly, a high schooler, like you probably remember, it's like you have to be at school at 7:30 in the morning for band practice, and then it's school all day, and then it's track, and then it's mock trial and newspaper, like all these random things that I did. I was gone all day, and I think I just didn't really know how to fuel myself well, and also didn't have mentors or teammates that were necessarily checking in on that type of thing. But anyway, all this is to say, like, I was definitely in the red zone for relative energy deficiency in sport, showed up in college, and then started being more restrictive about what I was eating. And that's probably the last thing that I needed to do at that point because I was already in this red zone. And, as a result, this led to a bunch of injuries down the line in college, even once I course corrected and figured out how to fuel myself better. The damage that you can do to your body in that relative energy deficiency state for bone health, it can really have a lot of long-term effects.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's so fascinating that you have that transition from more unintentional REDS symptoms, which is, I've also experienced that. It's really challenging when you're busy to honestly eat enough if you're training a lot, and then going in more into the intentional zone. But recognizing that in college, maybe the support structures aren't there for you to even understand how you're damaging your body down the road when it seems like the right thing to do at the time. So how did you kind of get to that turning point of recognizing how to course correct? Like you said, you course corrected. What did that look like for you? But you still were struggling with injuries then.
Yeah, well, it's interesting. I feel like we're condensing really many, many years into a pretty short timeline. But for me, it took a super, super long time to even make the connection that like any of these injuries could be related to training, could be related to hormones, could be related to fueling. It took me so long to figure that out, largely because as soon as, back in high school, I was getting ready to go to college. I hadn't been getting my period for a little while. And I ended up, checking in with my primary care doctor about it and getting referred to this pediatric endocrinologist who was like, oh, this is totally fine. Runners generally will end up losing their period because they train a lot. So you can just go on birth control and everything will be fine. And this is a topic that we're going to come back to again, is like the medical system is great for a lot of things. But at this time, there was not a lot of knowledge about how to support the young female endurance athlete. And the reason that you don't want to go on birth control if you're like a young female endurance athlete who's experiencing REDS is that you then won't actually know if you're in a state of energy balance or not, because on birth control, generally you have this withdrawal bleed that's sort of quasi-period-like, but it's not a natural cycle. It's fake hormones. And so you don't know if you're actually in that state of energy balance. And so for me, like I really was flying blind. I'm on birth control this whole time in college, and I'm getting, stress fracture after stress fracture, two pretty major high-risk areas. One of those also happened right before I was supposed to go to the World Championships, the age group worlds in Australia. Didn't get to go because of this injury. And so anyway, it was after that second stress fracture. And all the while I'd gotten more into triathlon in college. I was really enjoying it, and I was doing pretty well with this sport. I think after the second stress fracture, I was like, this can't just be a fluke. So I ended up with a stress fracture in my sacrum, which is this triangle bone at the base of your spine. And it's in the middle of your body. And you're like, I didn't fall over. I didn't get hit by a bowling ball. Like, there's got to be something going on. So for me, course correcting really involved trying to figure out, like, why is this happening and where are some answers? And at that time, I think there's a lot more information even right now than there was, say, in like 2018, 17, I think that this was. But I was, trying to look up podcasts and trying to describe symptoms and be like, this is sort of what I'm going through, and have people experience this before. And eventually I did end up getting connected with like the few medical centers that were actually very centered on relative energy deficiency in sport, and the female athlete triad is a related condition that people talk about. And I was able to get some help, but it was such a long journey to get there. And I always think back and I'm like, wow, if someone had just told me when I was 17 or 18 to try to avoid this, then maybe it wouldn't have spiraled into the really long journey that it was.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that hits so hard on why all of these conversations are so important and why it's so great to see more resources coming out. Obviously, there's a lot more work to do, but books like Good for a Girl, and then similarly the research that's being done, because like you mentioned, like this is a years long process. Like for you, this was high school through post-college, right? Is that true?
Yeah, it was only after college that I really started getting it figured out.
Yeah, so that's like 10 years-ish, right, of going through all of these different things. And how much could we impact younger female athletes going through these things at a young age if we could have more of this education and open conversation about some of the warning signs. So that's really big. How, when you were course correcting later on, did you feel that you were able to make the positive changes and be supported by, like you mentioned, some of these medical centers, but where did you actually get some of those resources and kind of keep that good behavior up?
Yeah, so I think it was a combination of, being connected with the right doctors. I got connected with like a sports nutritionist for a little while. I ended up, again, just doing a huge deep dive on learning about these topics on my own, given the resources that were out there. So at the time, there were a handful of podcasts, a handful of like random blog posts that I was looking at. But I think honestly, a lot of it came down to this just like willpower of, I do not want to get injured again. I don't want to miss another world championships. I don't want to miss another big race because of something that I think is controllable. And I think I started to realize like, okay, in order to do that, I have to have a regular menstrual cycle. I have to be fueling my body really well. My body might need to change a little bit and finally reach its, adult form and settle where it's supposed to be. That's another topic that comes up a lot in Good for a Girl, is just like riding the wave of adult development. So those things all sort of came together. And I think ultimately now I'm at this place where I have not been injured, knock on wood, in like 5 years. Maybe little soft tissue things will show up and bother me for a week or something. But in general, I think I've cracked the code on figuring out how to do this in a healthy way, but it didn't need to be such a long journey, And I think the other challenge is once you're making those changes, you do start to run into a lot of other issues that we'll talk about on this podcast, is like these cultural assumptions and people really believing that the leaner you are, the better you're going to be, and comments about body that I have definitely encountered throughout my time in sport. I think the more you get into it and the more people you train with, often, but not exclusively male athletes, do have a lot of assumptions about, going back to that soccer goalie story, what the female body looks like and what it's capable of. Those things are often very, very different, but people tie them together very closely.
Yeah, absolutely. It's like reminding yourself constantly that your fitness is a feeling, not a look, and just reckoning that I think that's so real. You can look across. Like I'm a trail runner primarily, and I love the trail running scene. From what I can tell when I've gone to races, is that you look at the starting line and every body looks different, and everyone is kind of approaching their race for their own body and doing like this incredible feat with their bodies. And I think it's amazing to see and totally resonate with trying to come around to that mentality when there's a lot of external pressure. So that'll be a big deep dive episode later.
Yeah, absolutely.
So now, I mean, you've been crushing triathlons. You haven't been injured in 5 years. That's pretty amazing. Congrats to you.
Thank you.
What keeps you in it now? Like, why do you love it so much?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think like despite all these challenges, and of course we put a lot of the spotlight on challenges right here, I also have to say that being involved in endurance sports, being a part of this community is the most fulfilling thing in my life. So I'm not sure if everyone knows this, but I am also in the process of this major life pivot right now. I'm about to finish up a PhD in political science, and I'm like not going to be a political scientist because I realized how much I care about this space. I care about the research. I care about the just supporting other women through coaching, through community and everything like that. But it's something that I think is really integral to who I am. We've talked about these traits of feeling strong, feeling capable, feeling confident. And also, I think for me, being involved in coaching and research is entirely fueled by just me not wanting other people to experience this stuff that was not so great that I experienced. And obviously, some injuries and challenges are somewhat inevitable, but if there's any role that I can have in trying to prevent that, like that's exactly why I'm here. And I want to be sort of the mentor and coach and role model that I didn't necessarily have in this space. But it's nice because that dovetails with just like getting to do the stuff. I love going for a run. I love being in the mountains. I love riding my bike. And I think making that life pivot and kind of making it through this journey to where I am right now, it speaks so much to who I am that it's been really exciting to kind of unify it with initiatives like this podcast.
Yeah, that's so awesome. And totally agree that you're able to do a lot of impact with just telling your story and getting more people aware of some of the concerns. So thanks for sharing. I know it's a quick gloss over. I'm sure there's so much more we could dive into, and we will on later episodes. But I think that hit on a lot of the main themes that we were already previewing.
Definitely. And now I'm excited to turn it over to you and hear a little bit about your story, because I think we've talked about a lot of these shared themes, but also some of our own unique experiences. So I'm going to start with the very same question. Elena, how did you get into your sport and get to where you are right now?
Yeah, I also have to go way back, way back, I guess. Funnily enough, like I actually didn't get into trail running until really post-college. Although I remember always loving to be outside. Like one of my first or earliest happy memories is my dad's from Vermont. My grandparents lived in Vermont, so I spent a lot of time in Vermont growing up. And I remember climbing Mount Mansfield with my dad when I was 4, and then he just started taking off running down it, and I was trying my best to keep up, and I felt like I was flying. I'm sure I wasn't moving all that quickly, but it was the coolest feeling. And so it's kind of funny how I came back to trail running way later. But I grew up in Ohio. There's not really mountains in Ohio. And I grew up an ice hockey player, all things. So I started when I was also 4 years old. Yeah, I was young. There wasn't also girls ice hockey. So my dad actually petitioned the league, and I was able to play with 6-year-old boys when I was 4 years old. So I guess in my sport world, I grew up really surrounded by boys. Like that was what I experienced. I was the only girl. I think it set some pretty early stage, like gender, I guess, confusion or expectations of how I was presenting myself, because I didn't have any female role models in hockey. And it was before social media, or I was so little. I wasn't able to access like, oh, look at the, women's Olympic team or whatever.
So you must have thought that like in order to be an athlete, you just had to be like a boy. That was probably the only frame of reference that you had.
Totally. I mean, that was like my internalized response to what I was seeing in the world, was that if I wanted to express myself as an athlete, then I was a boy. So I had short hair. I acted like a boy. I wore basketball shorts, and that was pretty much who I was growing up. When I was 12, I remember being told, so this is like, it really didn't matter, I guess, until pre-puberty. But when I was 12 was when they were like, hey, you can't dress in the locker room with the boys anymore. And I was devastated. I was so upset. And that meant that I basically was just getting dressed in whatever spare room, different rinks had that we were traveling around to. So I got dressed in like the women's bathroom stalls. That was pretty common. Or I remember once I got dressed in the closet where they stored all the vending machine drinks. So I did get to snag a free Powerade, which is actually pretty clutch, but I was always separated from the team as a result. And I didn't start playing girls hockey until I was a little older and I had to travel really far. So I'd go to Pittsburgh to play with a team that was all girls from around the nation that didn't really have a place to play, but were all good. And then in high school, I went away for a couple seasons to Vermont to play with a high-level girls team and ended up committing to Dartmouth when I was a junior. And so all that time I was taking hockey really, really seriously, but I also loved other sports. I ran cross country. And so while I was in this really competitive hockey environment and still kind of feeling like I was measuring up against boys most of the time because that's who I was playing with, I was really fortunate to have a cross country coach who was awesome. And I had spent my whole life measuring myself against boys. And I will never forget that she, during a practice when I was a senior and honestly not feeling all that fast, like I had gone through puberty at that point, had grown a lot and was significantly slower than what I was my sophomore year. She had these freshman boys and she, during a workout, told them if they wanted to be fast to try to keep up with me. And it was the first time that a coach had ever kind of referenced guys trying to keep up with me as opposed to the other way around. I was always told I was too small, that I couldn't handle the physicality of boys hockey, all this stuff. So that really was a powerful experience. But I think that kind of instilled my love of running while I was still riding the very intense hockey wave.
And I think it speaks too to the power of these mentors, right? Early on, like that was something I certainly didn't have, but having someone believe in you from a really young age, I feel like that's one of the most valuable things you can have in sport. And I feel like I'm always trying to instill that, but it sounds like she had a huge impact on just how you see yourself in an athlete.
Oh, totally. And I think that's really a shout out to all the great coaches out there. I feel like I had some really bad coaches as well, and they had their own damaging perspectives on how I felt as an athlete. But then when you have a really uplifting coach who really just cares about developing whole people and not just you as a performing athlete, then I think it goes such a long way. So uplifting all those coaches out there, we appreciate you. You're having a huge impact whether or not you realize it. But yeah, I went to college to play hockey, but I think that's when the wheels started kind of coming off the bus because I had been feeling this like pressure towards the end of high school of just the intensity of hockey. I remember being told at the national development camp by an Olympian who was my coach that it was ridiculous actually that I weighed so much less than her when she was shorter than me and that I had to put on 20 pounds by the next year. And I was just like, how is my body so obviously flawed? I felt like it was kind of out of my control. And then simultaneously, and this is kind of another aspect that we can talk about later with body image, but for me, the strength of a hockey player was up at odds against like the societal pressure of the male gaze. And I felt that very intensely, especially as a freshman in college of, I wanted to be a bigger, stronger hockey player. I also wanted to be attractive and I was getting these mixed messages and all the while I felt like my life was a little bit out of my control with training regimens and how just like all the pressure. And I think all of this kind of spiraled into me deciding that the one thing I could control was like how fit I was going to be. And so I just started grinding too hard. I remember I would like wake up at 6 and do a plyometric workout before going to my morning lift and then my morning skate. And all the while I was trying to do this on the super clean diet of like 1,500 calories a day or something, which was just like way too small. So it was, I think in hindsight, I am lucky actually that I didn't go down an even worse path. Like it was pretty short-lived because what I ended up doing was quitting the hockey team at the end of my freshman year, recognizing that clearly I was just really unhappy and I just needed some time to kind of figure out what I wanted and who I wanted to be as a whole, not just as an athlete. But it took me a while to recover from that, I would say. Like I had a negative period for a bit.
Totally. And I mean, I commend you. Like it's really hard to talk about this stuff, right? It's definitely a dark time. And I sort of wish we'd known each other during our freshman year because I think we were probably in a pretty similar boat. But it's super natural for this stuff to come up when you're in these environments where there's a lack of control. And I think the transition from high school to college, especially for women, but really for all people can be really, really jarring. You're used to having an ultra scheduled life. And as soon as you move into this sort of nebulous, like you have a lot to do, but it's all on your own terms in college environment, intersect that with sport, intersect that with fueling, intersect with the fact that you have to just keep yourself alive. And it's really hard. So I think just like I want to empathize. And if there's college students out there who are listening are like, it's really hard. Like, yeah, it super is. And you can get through it, but it's not easy.
Totally. Yeah, I do wish I had known you. Or honestly, I feel like everyone was kind of in the same boat. Because the other thing I'll say on that is that, and I think we've maybe mentioned this before to each other, Katie, but once you've experienced an eating disorder in any circumstance, I think it's so easy to spot the signs. And what I was experiencing was not unique to me. I would look around my team. My teammates were all having their own kind of disordered eating patterns, some obviously more than others, but it was pretty common. And I saw it in the dining rooms with the athletes. It was pretty common. So everyone was kind of going through it in their own way. But because of that, I think it normalized it and no one really saw it as a red flag. I remember not recognizing it as a red flag until I did like a free wellness event. I don't know if you remember these at Dartmouth, Katie, but they had one of those like wellness center events and then you could get free stuff. And to get something like a free swag, you had to fill out a survey. And the woman pulled me aside being like, I think we need to talk about your eating habits. And I was like, I'm fine. Like, I'm just getting a little bit fitter right now and then I'm going to be fine. And that was kind of jarring. So that was my wake-up call. And then I quit hockey, which was really positive for me because it really allowed me to start working out in a way that felt good for my body, however that was.
And probably good for your mind too at that point.
Exactly. I think I was kind of burnt out on just doing a single sport. I mentioned I loved doing everything growing up, and then it was just kind of really intense all at once. So yeah, it was great for my mind. And the positive side of that is that I just started doing things that made me feel good. And I remember one other big pivotal experience was wanting to go see the foliage, and I didn't have a car, but I had a bike, and I biked to the Guile Fire Tower from campus and then ran up it. And it felt like, wow, I can achieve whatever I want to do. I can just like say I want to do something and go make it happen. And that started this just desire to come up with these more outdoorsy mountain adventures and just do them. So I got more into running, I got more into biking, and it was totally unstructured. I didn't do anything competitive, but I just loved it. So that was kind of my transition into more positive of just like how it made me feel and rediscovering my confidence outside of what people were telling me to do in a very structured athletic environment, which was most of my upbringing apart from that.
It's nice too, because we've talked a lot about this gaze and these body expectations, but when you're just creating your own adventures and you're in charge, that might still exist internally, but there isn't the same external pressure from coaches or from mentors or from teammates. And I think that's really a nice break. You know, it doesn't mean that if you need to take a break, that it has to be a break from all forms of movement. It's more from just like this pressure and these expectations, which are performance related, they're body related, but I'm really glad you're able to sort of find that and have your niche. I had a similar experience kind of post-college when I was trying to figure out what I wanted to do and COVID hit. And I was like, well, great, I'm just going to do adventures. And I think that was a big turning point in my life.
Absolutely. I feel like once you start like doing it for yourself, it gives you the time and space to recognize all the pressures that you were up against and then kind of redefine what your own wants and what success looks like to you is. And so then I could really much more strongly fight off those pressures because I had a much stronger outward facing, I guess, protective wall in my brain of what was good for me, what was helpful for me alone and not for the other expectations I saw. So that was super helpful. I ended up traveling for a while after college and I used running and just longer running adventures in the mountains as a way of exploring new places. So it really just became my happy place as like, this was just me doing things to learn more about the world and to learn more about myself. And then I moved to Seattle after college for work and just fell in love with the atmosphere out there. And that's where I think the theme of community comes in really strongly. And something I really want to hit on is that, like, yeah, I mentioned growing up, it was really just me with the boys and then me always comparing myself to the boys. And then even in college, it was a very like male dominated environment. Still, I definitely felt the male gaze pressure a lot and how people talked about women's bodies. So then coming out to Seattle for the first time in my life, I had a group of really strong, awesome women who would just be down for adventures all the time, different kinds of things. We would go on runs, we would go on long bike rides, we would combine sports, we would swim, we would do everything. And it was just such a cool experience to feel so empowered and inspired by a group of women. And I had never experienced that before. So that kind of is what pushed me into this endurance world even stronger, because I just felt so supported. And I was realizing for the first time that I might have a talent at endurance sports, and particularly running, because I was able to test myself with these women who encouraged me to do these adventures. So that was really, really cool. And that's honestly what keeps me so excited about it, is that everywhere I go, I connect with women like what we connected with at that wedding, or how we've connected with other people in different places, of just this love of adventure and supporting each other and kind of like working through a very challenging world environment through what I would describe as a very tangible way of focusing on it through endurance sports. It's a very tangible expression of what a lot of hard to articulate cultural issues. So I feel like women can really connect on that in a much more meaningful way.
Yeah, I think that the relationships that I've had through other women endurance sports have probably been some of the most meaningful ones in my life. And that's a lens through which I've made some of my current best friends have been meeting each other through these endurance sport things later on in life. And I didn't even know that that was really going to happen. It's this thing that you get into because you're focused on performance goals, and me being interested in high school cross country, but knowing that that was going to shape who I am as a person really across age spans. I mean, I've gotten to know people who are older, people who are younger, people who are around the same age as me. But there's something about that shared experience that I think you can't really replicate as easily outside of this like working hard together context, and realizing that you're all up against the same forces. And you all have really, really similar thoughts. Sometimes they're going to be different. Sometimes you can lean on each other's perspectives, but we all are experiencing this together.
Totally. Yeah, it's a very, very powerful community. So that's definitely what keeps me in it. In addition to, I think you mentioned this as well, but like I love knowing that I have a way to be outside every day. I love exploring, and I love how I get to keep learning about myself and the world through the sport. So I'm super excited to be a part of it every day. It keeps me in it. And the negative stuff, like I see it for sure. I think I feel a lot more positive and optimistic about how we approach it these days because of these kinds of conversations and what I'm seeing happening in the space as a broader group of people sharing new experiences. So yeah, very excited to continue the conversation. And that was also, I know it was a lot, but still kind of a gloss over. So there's a lot of things that we could dive deeper into.
Yeah, we have a lot of stories to share beyond the ones that we shared today. So going forward, kind of what this will look like is we'll go through, each episode is going to center around that broad topic that we talked about. And then we'll weave in stories from people that filled out our form. We're going to weave in some of our own stories for each one. And hopefully we'll continue to get content. And who knows? I mean, this could go in a lot of different directions. I'm excited to see what we do next. But we know that there's a lot of stories out there that should be shared. So really excited to do that with you.
Yeah. So honestly, share all feedback. If you have any thoughts or questions or things that you want to see us talk more about, we're all ears for that. And then also, we mentioned before, but we got this incredible crowdsourced list of gear from everyone that are more for female athletes. So we'll share that in the show notes as well, because there's some good stuff in there.
Yeah. If you've ever been looking for 15 different shorts recommendations, then we have that for you. So, and we vetted them. Awesome. Well, thank you so much for listening. This has been really, really fun. I feel like I've learned a lot about you, Elena, and maybe also about myself. Reflecting on this, I'm like, oh my gosh, me not being a goalie in soccer is all related to these topics. So it's been fun to do that deep dive. And I think the next few weeks are going to be a lot of fun. So really looking forward to doing that with you.
Yeah, same. It's funny how each step along the way matters in some way, shape, or form, but it's hard to put it all together until later. So yeah, absolutely excited to keep talking.
Definitely. And other people out there, think back to your early times, because that's probably relevant to who you are now, and we want to hear all about it. So thank you all. We'll be back next Monday with our second episode on the female body. And thanks for listening.